Steve Harvey had facilitated countless emotional moments during his extensive tenure hosting Family Feud, yet nothing in his professional experience prepared him for what transpired on that December afternoon in 2024. The Harrison family from Charleston, South Carolina, assembled on stage for their Fast Money round, and among them stood 87-year-old James Harrison, whose bearing conveyed both the fragility of advanced age and an unmistakable sense of purpose. James moved toward the podium with deliberate steps, supported by a walking cane crafted from polished oak, and the studio audience responded with respectful applause that reflected their recognition that something significant was about to occur. James presented himself in a manner that suggested careful preparation for this appearance. He wore a navy blazer over a pressed white dress shirt, and a burgundy tie completed his formal attire. His silver hair was neatly groomed, and despite the physical limitations evident in his movements, his blue eyes maintained a clarity and intensity that immediately captured attention. The Harrison family had secured victory in the main game, with strong performance across all rounds, and they now required only 68 points in fast money to claim the $20,000 prize. James's grandson had completed the initial fast money round with a score of 132 points, establishing a solid foundation that made the family's success appear likely. Steve approached James with his characteristic warmth, though he modulated his typical energetic style to accommodate the elderly contestants' measured pace. Before beginning the standard fast money questions, Steve engaged in preliminary conversation, inquiring about James's background and what had motivated the family to pursue this opportunity. James's response carried a weight that transcended conventional game show interaction. He explained in a voice that remained strong despite his years that his wife Eleanor had passed away 7 months earlier after 62 years of marriage, and that her final words to him had contained instructions she wanted shared with the world if he ever found himself in a position to reach a wide audience. Steve's expression immediately registered the gravity of what James had introduced into what was meant to be entertainment programming. He asked James to describe Eleanor and their life together. James's response revealed depths of emotion carefully controlled, but clearly present beneath his composed exterior. He described Eleanor as an extraordinary woman who had demonstrated courage and wisdom throughout their marriage, particularly during the most challenging period of their shared life. He explained that they had raised 4 children together while navigating circumstances that would have destroyed many families, and that Eleanor's strength and clarity of vision had preserved their family when all external forces seemed determined to tear them apart. The studio audience grew notably quieter as James spoke, and even crew members who had witnessed countless tapings found themselves drawn into the unfolding narrative. Steve asked James whether he wished to share Eleanor's final words before or after completing the fast money questions. James stated with quiet firmness that Eleanor had been explicit in her instructions regarding the sequence of events. She wanted him to answer the fast money questions first, to demonstrate that their family had achieved stability and success despite their history, and only then to reveal the message she wanted conveyed to anyone who might hear it. Steve agreed to honor Eleanor's specified sequence, and they proceeded with the fast money segment. The questions followed the established format, but the atmosphere in the studio suggested that everyone present understood they were participating in something that extended beyond standard game show proceedings. When asked to name a popular sandwich, James responded with turkey without hesitation. For something people check multiple times per day, he stated their phone. When asked how many hours constitute a good night of sleep, James answered 7. For a place people go to think, he said church. Finally, when asked to name something people do to stay healthy, James responded with walking. Each answer was delivered with the same calm certainty, as though James had prepared not merely by studying common survey responses, but through some deeper process of readiness for this moment. As the results were revealed, the audience's engagement intensified with each successive outcome. Turkey claimed the number one position with 44 points. Phone was the top answer with 37 points. 7 hours of sleep secured the number one spot with 29 points. Church as a place for thinking earned the number 3 position with 18 points. Walking as a health practice claimed the number 2 answer with 26 points. James had accumulated 154 points independently, bringing the family total to 286 points and securing their victory by a substantial margin. The Harrison family celebrated with obvious joy, surrounding James with embraces and expressions of pride. However, James himself maintained remarkable composure, accepting their affection while conveying through his demeanor that his primary purpose remained unfulfilled. As the initial celebration subsided, James raised his hand in a gesture that, while physically modest, carried sufficient authority to restore immediate silence throughout the studio. James stated clearly that he needed to honor his promise to Eleanor by sharing the words she had spoken to him in her final conscious moments before her death. He explained that fulfilling this obligation was the genuine reason his family had pursued the opportunity to appear on the program, and that everything leading to this point had been preparation for what he was about to reveal. Steve moved closer to James, his professional instincts recognizing that the emotional center of this entire experience was about to manifest. He assured James that he had everyone's complete attention, and that he should share whatever Eleanor had wanted communicated. James took a measured breath, steadying himself with both hands on his cane, before beginning to speak. He explained that to understand Eleanor's final words, people needed to understand the context from which those words emerged. In 1962, when James and Eleanor had been married for only 3 years and were raising 2 young children with a third on the way, James was arrested and convicted of armed robbery. He stated this fact with neither defensiveness nor self-pity, simply presenting the truth of what had occurred. The robbery had taken place at a convenience store, and while no one was physically injured during the incident, James had carried a weapon and had threatened the store clerk. He'd received a sentence of 15 years in prison. Eleanor was 24 years old when James was incarcerated, suddenly responsible for raising their children alone, with virtually no financial resources, and facing the social stigma associated with having a husband in prison. James described how the easy choice for Eleanor would have been to divorce him, to tell their children their father had abandoned them, and to rebuild her life without the burden of maintaining connection to someone who had betrayed their family through criminal behavior. Instead, Eleanor made a decision that shaped the next 60 years of their shared existence. She committed to preserving their marriage and ensuring their children maintained relationship with their father. Eleanor worked multiple jobs to support their family while bringing the children to visit James in prison every single week, without fail, for the entire 15 years of his incarceration. She faced judgment from neighbors, family members, and strangers who questioned why she remained loyal to a man who had demonstrated such poor judgment and disregard for his family's well-being. She endured financial hardship that forced her to accept charity she found humiliating, and to make sacrifices that affected not only her own quality of life, but also the opportunities available to their children. Through all of this, Eleanor maintained her commitment to James and insisted to their children that their father's worst mistake did not define the totality of who he was as a person. James's voice wavered slightly as he described the day of his release from prison in 1977. He had been terrified that despite Eleanor's faithfulness during his incarceration, the reality of his return would reveal the impossibility of truly rebuilding their marriage and family after 15 years of separation. Instead, Eleanor welcomed him home with genuine warmth and immediately began the process of reintegrating him into their family life. She had prepared their children for his return, had secured employment possibilities for him despite his criminal record, and had maintained their home as a place he could return to, rather than a place where he was merely tolerated as a consequence of her duty. The family's subsequent years were not without difficulty. James struggled to find stable employment and to adjust to civilian life after 15 years of incarceration. Their children experienced varying degrees of difficulty processing their father's absence during formative years and his return during their adolescence and young adulthood. Financial pressures remained constant, and the social stigma of James's criminal history continued to affect the family's interactions within their community. Through all of these challenges, Eleanor remained the stabilizing force that held their family together, consistently demonstrating forgiveness, patience, and determination to move forward, rather than remaining trapped by past mistakes. James paused in his narrative, and Steve, who had been listening with visible absorption, asked the question that was clearly on everyone's mind. He inquired what Eleanor's final words had been, and why she had been so insistent that James share them publicly if given the opportunity. James's response carried an emotional intensity that transformed the atmosphere in the studio from attentive interest to profound engagement. He explained that Eleanor had been admitted to hospice care in May 2024 after a brief battle with aggressive cancer. During her final week of life, she had remained lucid enough to have meaningful conversations with James and their children about her impending death and the legacy she hoped to leave. 3 days before Eleanor died, during a moment alone with James, she had taken his hand and spoken words that James said he would remember with perfect clarity for whatever time remained to him. Eleanor had told him that the decision she made in 1962 to remain committed to their marriage despite his incarceration had been the most important decision of her life. Not because it led to personal happiness, although it ultimately had, but because it had taught her something essential about the nature of human beings and the possibility of redemption. Eleanor told James that she had learned through their experience together that people's worst actions do not represent the sum total of their character. That capacity for change and growth exists even in individuals who have made terrible choices, and that communities become stronger when they create pathways for redemption rather than permanent exile for those who have committed wrongs. Eleanor's final words, which she had made James promise to share if given a platform, were these: "Tell people that forgiveness is not about forgetting or excusing what was done wrong. Tell them that forgiveness is about refusing to let the worst moment of someone's life become the permanent definition of who they are. Tell that I never forgot what you did to our family, but I also never stopped believing that you could become someone different. Tell them that you proved me right, and that our children and grandchildren exist in the world as good people because I chose to believe in redemption rather than punishment. Tell them that America needs to learn this lesson, that we imprison too many people for too long and then make it impossible for them to rebuild their lives when they are released. Tell them that if they claim to believe in second chances, they need to create actual opportunities for people to have those second chances, rather than just speaking words that sound nice but mean nothing." The studio had fallen into absolute silence as James delivered Eleanor's message. When he finished speaking, Steve Harvey stood motionless for several long moments, visibly struggling to maintain composure. Tears began streaming down his face, and he made no attempt to hide his emotional response. He turned away from James and the cameras, his shoulders shaking as he processed what he had just heard. The audience sat in stunned quiet, and crew members stood frozen in their positions, recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended their professional roles and required human response rather than technical execution. After nearly 2 minutes, Steve returned to James and pulled him into a careful embrace, mindful of the elderly man's physical frailty. When Steve stepped back and began to speak, his voice was thick with emotion, and his carefully cultivated professional persona had been completely stripped away, leaving only authentic human response. He stated that Eleanor's message had cut through every defense he had constructed around certain topics, that he had held opinions about criminal justice and incarceration without fully considering the human reality of what those opinions meant for actual families struggling with actual consequences of actual mistakes. Steve explained to the audience and to the cameras that he had grown up believing that people who committed crimes deserved whatever punishment they received, and that any difficulties they faced after release from prison were simply natural consequences of their poor choices. He admitted that he had never seriously considered how this perspective affected children who lost parents to incarceration, or how it shaped communities that essentially exiled individuals who had served their sentences but could never truly reintegrate into society because employment, housing, and social acceptance remained permanently out of reach. Steve acknowledged that hearing James's story and Eleanor's final message had forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own beliefs regarding redemption, second chances, and the purpose of punishment within society. He stated that Eleanor's distinction between forgiveness as acceptance of wrongdoing versus forgiveness as refusal to allow one mistake to permanently define a person had articulated something he had never been able to express, but recognized as profoundly true. He described feeling challenged to reconsider his positions on criminal justice policy and to think more carefully about what genuine belief in redemption required beyond comfortable platitudes. Steve then turned to address James's family members standing behind him. He asked James's children, now adults in their 50s and 60s, whether they would be willing to share their perspectives on growing up with an incarcerated father and on their mother's decision to maintain the family's connection to him. The oldest daughter, Patricia, stepped forward and spoke with careful precision about her experience. She explained that her childhood had been marked by confusion about why her father was absent and by the social stigma of having a parent in prison. She described the weekly prison visits as simultaneously precious opportunities to maintain connection and painful reminders of their family's abnormal circumstances. Patricia stated that she had sometimes felt angry with her mother for maintaining loyalty to a man who had caused such damage to their family, and that she had struggled during her teenage years with wondering whether her mother's commitment to forgiveness represented strength or weakness. However, Patricia explained, watching her father work diligently after his release to rebuild his life and restore his relationship with his children had taught her lessons about human capacity for change that had shaped her own approach to relationships and her professional work as a social worker serving formerly incarcerated individuals and their families. James's son Michael spoke next, describing his own journey from shame about his father's incarceration to pride in his father's transformation and gratitude for his mother's wisdom in refusing to give up on their family. Michael explained that he had spent his career as a public defender, representing indigent defendants in criminal cases, and that his family's experience had given him unique insight into the human beings behind criminal charges and the family systems affected by incarceration. He stated that his mother's example of maintaining compassion and commitment, even when doing so, required personal sacrifice, had provided a model for his own professional dedication to ensuring that defendants received vigorous representation, regardless of the charges against them or the likelihood of conviction. The remaining children shared similar reflections, each describing how their mother's decision and their family's experience had shaped their understanding of justice, mercy, redemption, and human nature. The cumulative effect of these testimonies was powerful, illustrating how Eleanor's choice in 1962 had rippled forward through decades and generations, shaping not only her immediate family, but also the clients her children served in their various professional roles and the communities where they lived and worked. Steve Harvey announced that his foundation would be establishing the Eleanor Harrison Second Chance Initiative, focused on providing employment opportunities, housing assistance, and community support for formerly incarcerated individuals attempting to rebuild their lives after release. He stated that the Harrison family's $20,000 prize would serve as the initial contribution to this initiative, and he committed his foundation to matching that amount multiple times over. Steve explained that this program would work with employers willing to hire formerly incarcerated individuals, with landlords willing to rent to people with criminal records, and with community organizations providing mentorship and support services to ease the transition from incarceration to community reintegration. Steve acknowledged that this initiative would likely generate controversy, given widespread public skepticism about rehabilitation and concern about public safety. However, he insisted that Eleanor's message and the Harrison family's lived experience demonstrated that current approaches to criminal justice often created permanent underclasses of people who could never fully re-enter society despite having served their sentences, and that this situation harmed not only formerly incarcerated individuals, but also their families and communities. He stated that he could not claim to believe in redemption while remaining passive in the face of systemic barriers that made redemption functionally impossible for millions of people. The episodes broadcast 3 weeks later generated immediate and intense response across multiple platforms and communities. Social media conversations reflected deep divisions regarding criminal justice policy, with some viewers praising Steve and the Harrison family for highlighting important issues, while others criticized them for allegedly minimizing the harm caused by criminal behavior and the legitimate concerns of crime victims. News organizations across the political spectrum covered the story, with interpretations varying dramatically based on ideological orientation and assumptions about punishment, rehabilitation, and public safety. Criminal justice reform organizations celebrated the attention brought to issues they had been working on for years, noting that Eleanor's message and the Harrison family's story provided compelling human illustration of abstract policy arguments. Organizations working with formerly incarcerated individuals reported increases in donations and volunteer applications following the episode's broadcast. Several employers contacted Steve's foundation, expressing interest in participating in the Second Chance initiative by creating employment opportunities specifically for formerly incarcerated individuals. However, victims' rights organizations expressed concern that the focus on redemption for those who committed crimes risked minimizing the permanent harm experienced by crime victims and their families. These organizations emphasized that while individuals like James Harrison, who successfully rehabilitated themselves, deserved recognition, they represented only a portion of those who were incarcerated, and that public policy needed to maintain focus on public safety and victim support rather than prioritizing the needs of those who had chosen to engage in criminal behavior. Educational institutions incorporated the Harrison family's story into curricula addressing criminal justice, ethics, and social policy. University professors assigned students to analyze the competing values and interests at stake in criminal justice policy decisions, using Eleanor's message and the family's experience as a case study, illustrating the human dimensions of what are often treated as purely technical policy questions. High school teachers used the story to facilitate discussions about redemption, second chances, and the purposes of punishment within democratic societies. Faith communities found Eleanor's message particularly resonant with theological commitments to redemption, forgiveness, and restoration. Religious organizations across various traditions organized discussion groups examining how their faith should inform their approach to criminal justice issues and their treatment of formerly incarcerated individuals. Many congregations established or expanded reentry ministries, providing practical support and community connection for people transitioning from incarceration to community living. 6 months after James's appearance on Family Feud, the program produced a follow-up segment providing updates on the Second Chance Initiative's impact. The segment featured several formerly incarcerated individuals who had secured employment through the program and were successfully rebuilding their lives. One man described how having stable employment and housing for the first time in years since his release had enabled him to restore relationships with his children and to envision a future beyond mere survival. A woman explained how mentorship and community support provided through the program had helped her navigate challenges she had not anticipated when released from prison and had given her hope that lasting change was possible. The follow-up segment also addressed the initiative's approach to accountability and public safety concerns. Program administrators explained that participants underwent careful screening, that support services included ongoing monitoring and intervention when participants struggled, and that the program maintained communication with law enforcement and community organizations to address any safety concerns proactively. They emphasized that creating opportunities for redemption did not mean ignoring risks or failing to maintain appropriate safeguards, but rather that effective public safety required helping formerly incarcerated individuals build stable lives rather than abandoning them to circumstances that made recidivism nearly inevitable. James appeared in the follow-up segment looking somewhat frailer, but expressing profound satisfaction with the response to Eleanor's message. He stated that Eleanor would have been pleased to know that her final words had sparked substantive conversations about criminal justice and had led to concrete assistance for people facing circumstances similar to those he had navigated after his release from prison decades earlier. James emphasized that Eleanor's decision to share her message publicly had been motivated not by desire for recognition, but by hope that their family's experience might contribute to policy changes and attitude shifts that would benefit people she would never meet. The segment concluded with Steve Harvey reflecting on how the experience had changed his own thinking and had influenced his approach to his platform and public voice. He described the process of developing the Second Chance Initiative as educational, forcing him to learn about criminal justice issues in depth and to confront the complexity involved in creating programs that balanced competing interests and values. He stated that James's appearance had been one of the most impactful experiences of his career, not because it confirmed beliefs he already held, but because it challenged him to reconsider assumptions and to recognize blind spots in his understanding of justice, mercy, and redemption. James Harrison passed away peacefully 2 years after his Family Feud appearance, having lived long enough to witness substantial growth in the Second Chance Initiative, and to see tangible evidence that Eleanor's final message had reached beyond their family to influence policy discussions and community practices. His funeral attracted significant attendance, including many formerly incarcerated individuals whose lives had been affected by the initiative established in Eleanor's name. Speakers at the funeral emphasized James's transformation from a young man who had made a devastating mistake to an elderly man who had lived decades of productive life, contributing to his family and community, demonstrating the human capacity for change that Eleanor had believed in, and that her final message had challenged others to recognize. The Eleanor Harrison Second Chance Initiative continues to operate and expand, having helped hundreds of formerly incarcerated individuals secure employment, housing, and community support necessary for successful reintegration. The initiative has become a model studied by criminal justice reform organizations and policymakers seeking evidence-based approaches to reducing recidivism while maintaining appropriate attention to public safety and victim concerns. Each person helped through the initiative is asked to share their own story of transformation and to articulate what second chances have meant in their lives, creating a growing collection of narratives that illustrate the human dimensions of criminal justice policy. Steve Harvey references James's appearance and Eleanor's final words regularly in interviews and public appearances, describing the experience as a pivotal moment in his understanding of his responsibilities as someone with a public platform. He has stated that witnessing James fulfill Eleanor's final request taught him that authentic emotional response was sometimes more valuable than polished professional performance, and that his decision to step away from the cameras while processing his emotions represented a moment of genuine human encounter that served the moment better than any scripted response could have achieved. The story of James and Eleanor Harrison, and the message she insisted be shared, continues to resonate in discussions about criminal justice, redemption, forgiveness, and the values that should guide community responses to wrongdoing. Eleanor's distinction between forgiveness as forgetting versus forgiveness as refusing to allow mistakes to become permanent definitions has been quoted in academic papers, policy documents, and sermons addressing how societies should balance accountability with opportunities for redemption. The Harrison family's experience demonstrates that personal stories shared through unexpected platforms can catalyze conversations that influence policy development and community practices, extending impact far beyond what any single family could achieve through private action alone.